coming off the colonial legacy. All right, so Iraq is a great example of this, where it's pretty extreme in its unclear manifestation. And the Ba'athist regime in its policies were very anti-tribal. And by tribal, what did they mean? What did they think besides segmentation and the problem of threat?
Basically, it's the sign of elitism or remnants.
Isn't that really interesting? So what does that mean? Why would tribalism, okay, but just hold on to that, right? So from the perspective of the Baptist, they said the image of the tribes is that it's remnants of colonialism. What else? Just put your, let's imagine we're in, independence mode. We're in anti-monarchical, republic, nationalist, we're setting up a secular, modern state. And we're going to get rid of these tribes. So what does the tribe represent from that perspective? Yeah.
Well, just that, like you said, the monarchy, like this idea of leadership through descent, not
So almost feudal, right? What else? Why is there, so if we understand sort of the question, the threat of loyalty, right? But it's not only the threat of loyalty. We're talking about the image of a tribe as feudal, colonial, as backward, right? This isn't modern loyalty, where you have citizens who have supposedly equal rights and equal relationship to some kind of centralized power for everybody. Okay? And so for the perspective, sort of backward. This is the image, right? And obviously, we know it's a question of a threat of loyalty. Now this one is very interesting because tribalism or that feeling of tribal loyalty is understood often as something that's very traditional, right? That's somehow essential to Middle East society or other societies. So how can it be colonial? What does that mean? What do you think? Right, because colonial systems are very recent. So how can it be both like backward, essential in some backward way, and also why were they saying it's colonial?
What it kind of represented like a patient-client situation where like the overseer would give ideas or plans to the tribal leaders, and the tribal leaders would dole it out on people themselves. So there was like a hierarchy that all went to the pyramid.
Pyramid structure, absolutely. So on the one hand, this is a rhetorical claim, in that anything in the post-colonial, in the early post-colonial context, you say is colonial, is something that you fight against. Right? It's pretty basic, right? So we label it colonial, and then we have some kind of shared animosity for it. So it's rhetorical on the one hand. On the other hand, like you said, colonialism represented this very hierarchical patron-client relationship that was manifest in politics for everybody. Yeah.
Did like remnants of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah. Remnants of the Ottoman Empire, excellent. So that would be part of what could be seen that we're going to go. But that's what's so interesting about these states. They didn't necessarily have such a fixation. There's like this interesting relationship to the past, right? In Iran, under the Pahlavis, remember I was saying how there's real interest in promoting a pre-Islamic past, right? And sort of getting rid of Islam as a point of national unity during the Pahlavi regime. In Iraq, it was pretty different, right? And yet that too, I think, was, let's get rid of this Ottoman remnant, this Ottoman past, that sort of then became a colonial past. It's all colonial, whether it's Ottomans or the British. Now they're all colonial. Yeah.
Now, like the Saddam tribe, I know that they attribute it to like a long extended history. Do they also attribute some of the tribal divisions to colonialism itself?
Exactly. So not only, so it's this very interesting sort of mix of stuff. It's sometimes contradictory, right? But very interesting, very rich. Where on the one hand, sort of the attack to say that the tribes are colonial is to say on the one hand, it's a rhetorical thing. Anything colonial is bad, we're moving beyond it. So anything we don't like, we'll just call it colonial. On the other hand, the future client, on the other hand, the remnants of the Ottomans. But also, there's this reference to, or recognition of, and we'll talk about this more, the way that the colonial structure actually manifests and sedimented tribal organization. How? Remember, I think not everyone's had tribal affiliations either, right? So how would a colonial system help shore up a tribal structure? What were they saying when they're sort of suggesting this? That in fact, tribal loyalty and tribal structures were helped by the colonial system, and in fact created, possibly maintained, by a colonial system. Yeah.
Were they saying that certain tribes were cooperating with the colonials and were gaining benefit through the patron clients that one tribe could take over the other one or be a pile of land over them?
Absolutely. So, on the one hand, it's a question of inequality. Like certain tribes get more authority in the colonial system, right? The colonial officer comes and says, okay, you tribe A, you look like you're in power, let's talk to you. And so that tribe someone. But even more than that, so yes, absolutely that. But on another level, there's, and this changes over time and people, but what was also sort of underlying this was this, pointing to feeling about, recognition maybe too strong a word, that colonial authorities came into the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and had to figure out who was in charge, who could influence other people, right? So if political organization is about decision-making and conflict resolution, and there is, you have a political situation that's somehow that has that, but is very flexible and fluid, right? So in the Arabian Peninsula, you have different political entities, right? Different groupings, and they have a structure of authority and decision-making and conflict resolution. But there's also quite a bit of movement, right? Not one person doesn't make a decision for everybody. And if people don't like that authority, you know what? There's a chance that they're going to put in somebody else in their place. Now, that kind of instability of not knowing who you're dealing with, and that you're going to continually deal with the same person, didn't mesh well with the colonial system, right? British colonial officials and officers, but not only British, right? But this is who was in the Persian Gulf and, in Iraq. Didn't like that potential flexibility and instability. What they wanted was someone they thought could agree with that, first of all. But not only that, but this is a person who they can rely on. So I'm going to go, sail back to London. When I come back next year to meet, it would be really helpful if it's the same person. right? It would be really helpful if I knew that that person was gonna be there and we could talk and that that person was gonna have authority over a bunch of people. Is everyone saying this? And so in that sense, the colonial structure helped formalize what was already, I mean, you can have a tribal structure, but it is also often very fluid. But in sedimenting it, right, and appointing people as sheikhs, so let's say you're in part of a clan, right, we're all genealogically related to each other, there's one of us who we recognize as, making good decisions that we follow, that works well for us, but then in a few years, this person's decision making isn't so great. And we decide, you know what, somebody else can do that for it. That kind of instability of a tribal structure did not mesh well with the empire, right? Again, they wanted to come back and make sure you're the same person I'm going to talk to this year, and if I come back 2 years from now, you're still going to be that person because I know you, we agree, we have an understanding. And so what happened was you had the situation where British colonial officials would try to appoint and say, okay, you're the sheikh. Rivka is the sheikh of our tribe, right? And we recognize you as the sheikh. We officially recognize you as the sheikh, which means that everyone else has to recognize you as the sheikh. And if people give you problems, let us know, we'll help you out. Is everyone following what's happening? So in that sense, people were saying this tribal structure is colonial in that Rivka is not only the tribal sheikh, but she's recognized as tribal sheikh not only from you guys, but because she now has British military support. Because it's in our interest to make sure that we have someone that we can agree with and who is stable. So that it's for that part of that reason that the idea of it, even though the notion of a tribe seems so traditional and essential and basic to the Middle East, it's in that vein that people were also saying, you know what, this tribal system is colonial. Right? Because we may have associated with ourselves, we might have organized ourselves politically to some extent, historically, but not quite that way, not quite to that extent. I mean, there's actually quite a bit of work done on the Persian Gulf states, right? Where the leaders of those same families who are ruling, for example, the Nakyans and Abu Dhabi and the Maktoums and Dubai and the Ottomans and Sharjah, these are the same families that the British colonial officials in the 19th century said, you're the sheikhs. So if you have a problem, come talk to us. We will help you. And then, and it's not to say that they weren't sort of leaders already. They may have been, to some extent, but not to the extent that they became with British military support.
Like for example, in Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud family have been given.
Oh, yeah.
So that could be an example of that.
Yeah, the Ibn Saud family, right? So Ibn Saud family, clearly a powerful family already, right? But by being allowed to take over the Hijaz on their own, that gives them, and then being recognized as the kings, and then being said, okay, if you have trouble, come talk to us, we'll help you. That, of course, shores up this tribal structure. Okay. So now we're saying, so that's why they're saying it's colonial, to some extent. But not, all of these things. All right, so that gets us to another level. So the state, modern state political organization, right, and the tribes, there are multiple ways in which they are dealt with. On the one hand, we see a situation where, in a place like Iraq, at first, the rhetoric is very anti-tribal. Right? precisely because it's a threat to the political organization. It's very clear, right? And it's described as, you know, feudal, backward, colonial, all these problems. But it gets very complicated. So what happens, let's just sort of repeat, what happens in a situation in Iraq where, so what do we see ultimately happening a few years later? So in the 60s, the Ba'ath Party first really puts down the tribes, tries to sort of get rid of them. And what do they do? Let's start with that. What do they do? What are the active policy initiatives? What do you imagine if you were, you know, president of Iraq and you had this conflicting loyalty to the state? What would you do? You're president. You're our sheikh. Let's put you in the place instead of the opposing rulership system. What are some things that you would do? Yes. So what would that, let's go on.
The land, their land, in many places, without the land, they don't really have anywhere to live, their power, lessons.
So there's a reorganization of agrarian life that's very clear that happens. And one of the first policy shifts, I mean, part of it is a socialist impulse, right, to redistribute land, right? And to get rid of this sort of supposed feudal structure where all the power and all the land is supposedly in the control of the sheikhs, right? So what do? You expropriate the sheikh's family land and you redistribute to the peasants or everyone else in the tribe. You say, now you have a plot, you have a plot, you have a plot, you have a plot. This sheikh, yeah, we'll give him a little plot of it. Right? So that's one of the absolute first things. What else do? We're being really harsh because we're building a new state and we want loyalty to us. What else do we do?
Aren't they also supporting like the stronger tribes to kind of overtake the weaker tribes? I think that was kind of the formula for not need.
Okay, but if you're trying to, let's imagine we're trying to undermine the power of the tribes. Right, so first thing you do is take away. Very clear. Then you take away what? You take away power and you take away what else?
Didn't they like make friends with some of them? Not make friends with the ones where they're friends. They would give the people that live in the tribe like electricity and water, and the ones.
No, I'm sorry. Yes, so there's a way of divide and conquer, right? So you give to, if you're a powerful tribe already and I don't agree with you, right? So I'm a state and I want to break loyalty. In practice, it ended up that you would sort of create another, you would give support to another tribe. But, I mean, that also what that does is say to this other tribe, okay, I have your support now, but I know this is tenuous. Because 5 years from now, you might decide another tribe, right? So there's this instability that's put into the tribal structure system. So that's what you can do. Create a sense of unknown, right? So you can't rely on Muhammad's tribe as being in power for 5 years later. I'll give you roads, I'll give you water, I'll give you electricity, so I'm going to shift. So this is kind of divide and conquer. Yeah, what else?
After the land instability, they gave them security through the state. Like they offered a lot of military jobs and a lot of positions in the civil service.
So on the one hand, you take land away from the tribal structure, and you give people little plots of land, right? We redistribute. But then the other thing you do is say, not only we're going to take stuff away and give you little plots of land, you're now going to rely on us because we are now going to provide roads, jobs. We're going to be the providers of economy. We're going to be the providers of infrastructure. We're going to be providers of state goods and services. So that's another thing. The other thing you can do, right, is think in terms of governing practices and decision making. So if decision making has been done through segment or if order has been maintained through, in part, segmentation, and decision making is maintained through descent and genealogy, right? What you can do, of course, as a state, is create an alternative decision making and an alternative order making structure. So you have police instead of segmentation. You have an army instead of internal segmentation. And so that anytime it seems like there's internal segmentation, structuring, maintaining order, you come in and you squash it. You say that's vigilante, that's not appropriate, we are the ruler, we are law. We have the monopoly on legitimate violence. Right? And you then set up structures for governance that are not tribal. I say, Karen, you're not part of this tribe, but I want you to be mayor. And I'm going to give you power. So not only am I going to uphold Rivka because she is the sheikh, and now she'll give her power, but now I'm going to give her that little plot of land over there, give everyone plots of land, and you know who's mayor? It's Karen. Karen doesn't have the tribal backing, but you have the state. Now you have my military, and you have my police, right? So you reorganize. I mean, it sounds very simple and basic because it's, you know, there are people who setting on these states, right? Okay. So now we're seeing an attempt, on the one hand, a simplistic attempt to undermine the authority of the tribes because of the threat they may give the state structure, right? But as we've read in these two articles, it's not sexism. Right? It's not simply about undermining that threat. What happens that makes it so much more? What do the states do? Heather, you're already talking about it. You're already saying what ultimately, how does it sort of evolve, or what happened in the 80s and 90s? These tribal structures. Yeah.
They end up moving the tribal leaders into powerful positions within administration.
Or some of them, right? Yeah. You start choosing, you say, okay, well actually, so why did they do that? Why did that happen in Iran? Why would that regime decide to say, you know what, completely squashing these tribes isn't working, right? They're already established, and they're giving us problems, right? So maybe what we should do, instead of trying to squash them, which is impossible, what should we do? We should appropriate them, right? Co-opt them. And we co-opt the ones who are in agreement with us. We give them benefits, we support them, we get rid of Karen and bring back Rivka, right? We're like, okay, we've done with you now we'll bring back Rivka, and we'll give you authority, and now but you know, again, and she wants to come back because she's seen this loss of power, and you know, now she knows what we can bring, and then you reestablish that. So but then what happens, you know, the language of tribes being colonial, tribes being feudal, tribes being, all of a sudden we have to revamp the rhetoric, right? So that's what's happening. So then you have to not only bring in the structure, but you have to revamp again the whole rhetoric to say, actually, you know what, we said it was colonial and feudal, but actually it's pretty traditional. And this is what we're going back to our roots, right? And this is how we manage our own problems. Okay. So, but then, of course, as I mentioned, you have this situation where, well, I mean, Iraq is, you know, very complicated, as you read in that. You know, some tribes were given power, some tribes were not given power. But as I said earlier, of course, not all people, whether it's in Iraq or Oman or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Algeria, the Middle East and Iran, belong to something called a tribe in the first place, right? That's not how they organized identification. So let's imagine a situation where, so in Iraq, you have this very clear anti-colonial, anti-tribal rhetoric at the beginning, and then it gets complicated and they're co-opted and divided and so on. Now let's imagine another situation where the notion of tribal identification is not so much something that is described as feudal, colonial, all backward, but is in fact, like in Jordan, right here we have a different situation where identification in Jordan, tribal identification is not seen in this, the Hashemite kings are still there. Right? It's the same family. So in Iraq, and that's why I like putting these two together, because it's the same family coming out of, Sheikh Hussein. So, it's the same family. In Iraq, the tribal are, first put down, then brought back, and it's part of the political state. In Jordan, it's that same family in rule. So for them, tribal identification is what? Why? So in Jordan, we have a very different understanding from the perspective of the state about tribal loyalty and authority. What is it in Jordan? In Iraq, it's about early, in the 50s and 60s. This is a problem of loyalty, a threat to the state, we need to squash it. In Jordan, how is it different?
Did they kind of accept it to the Hashemites as kind of the alternate tribe in a way?
Right, but go on.
Oh, yeah, but basically that they all had their own tribal, but they still always had respect for the Hashemites and kind of that they were the alternate.
Yeah.
Then,
That's right.
what I find out the reading is like the three specific group in Jordan currently. According to Dr. Ahmed, there's a tribe called Juham or something like that. They are the original Jordanians. And then the new elite class of the Hashemites came from Mecca.
Right.
And the third group is the Palestinians who came after 1948 war.
Right.
And in the village, I can pronounce the name, Bulka?
Yeah, Baba.
Bulka, yeah. It used to be under the Bedouins, but now it has been populated by the Palestinians. And now it creates a problem between the tribals and the Palestinians.
Right. Okay, so that's another very specific issue. But let's start from the level of, here we have a Hashemite state that is invested in the idea of tribal authority, of descent and genealogy. So it does not, on the one hand, it has a problem because it recognizes you can have another tribe, right, threatening the loyalty of the state, because it's a modern nation state, right? And so that's the tension. So you have a modern nation state, but that's still invested and brought from this tribal system, supposedly, right? And so it's in its interest to prop up, in terms of rhetoric, the idea of the tribal structure as traditional, right? Not colonial, but very traditional and essential and basic to national identity. So in Jordan, you have a series of other problems connected to that. First of all, is that you have a state where everyone is supposed to be equal, but yet there's a kingdom based on tribal, fatherly, patrilineal, patriarchal structure. But it's complicated in Jordan because, of course, like everywhere else in the Middle East, not everyone belongs to a tribe. In Jordan, the particular tensions, there are, sort of triangulated, where you have the Bedouin, who presumably are actually tribal, but they're not the elite. Is everyone, right? So that's on one hand. For the Bedouin, you have a national elite that's being cultivated in understanding themselves in tribal form from the Hashemites. So there you two. Then you have a third group, Palestinians, that make up, it's hard to know the percentages exactly of Jordan that is actually Palestinian origin, that came after 48 and beyond, but it is a large number. Yeah.
I just want to know history. I don't know the part. What is called Jordanian blackout? Like what Palestinians have to do with that? Jordanian blackout, something like that?
I'm not sure what you're,
Okay.
if you give me a little
No,
more.
I don't know myself what is that, but someone was talking the other day that Palestinians have something to do with Jordan, and it's Jordanian blackout or something like that. It's the term of it.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
We'll find out a little
Okay.
bit more.
Okay.
So, Jordan is made up of a very, very large minority that is Palestinian. And many of whom are not tribally organized, right? Never were, just aren't. That's not how political organization. So, the Jordanian state has, this tribal discourse that is propped up by the Hashemites, that's then propped up by the elite as a national identification, has contestation or problems on two sides. One, a very large minority that isn't tribal in the first place, tribally identified, right? And secondly, a Bedouin population that is, but doesn't really recognize the authenticity of the Hashemite tribal structure and the discourse that it's producing to its elites. Right? And that's the tension that Shryock is talking about. And as it is manifesting right in the written experiences of it. Okay. So in a place like Jordan, and very similarly in Oman, right? Oman and Jordan, I think, in Oman you don't have such a large minority like the Palestinians. It's not, that isn't the parallel. But as systems of rule, the king of Jordan and the Sultan of Oman were really good friends, and they saw themselves as sort of benevolent dictators that had a lot in common, and they, learned from each other a lot. So, but in both, there's this idea that you have a king or sultan who is very much like the father of the tribe. Right? It's the ultimate tribe structure. And the question is, how do you cultivate both this balance of creating loyalty to that tribe and not too much loyalty to somebody else's tribe? And then how do you bring in to the tribal discourse people who didn't have a tribal identification in the first place? And there are many ways that can be done. Primarily, very simply, it comes out in ways that maybe not intentional. Right? I'm not saying these are conspiracies out there that will make everyone imagine that they have a tribal structure. But, and these articles also pointed to this, that in both states, most formal official documents that you have to fill out, registering for school, filling out a form at the hospital, getting a post office box at your local post office, never mind getting a passport, any official registration requires you or asks you what your tribe is. So I would be, I'm filling out all these forms, I don't have a tribe. I don't belong to the tribe. Yeah.
Depending on the tribe, if somebody is part of the same type, does that affect the decision
What decision? Decision of what?
I guess the application or something, depending on what the person wants for the passport or.
That's a very good question, right? So how does it work in practice? Because one can see that then, am I going to help you because we're part of the same tribe? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, something like that, or.
Well, that's the question of loyalty.
Like that tribe.
Exactly. That's the problem with the state. That's exactly what the state is having. These modern states have problems with, because remember I was talking about asabiya and loyalty. So if you're in a tribe, your loyalty is to the other people in your tribe, not to the state, right? So if we are loyal because we belong to the same tribe, the presumption is that then we're going to help each other out. You come and you want a passport, I'm going to put me first in line. I'm like, you're tribe, X you're from this other village, but I read you're in the same tribe. I'll just help you out. Okay, so that doesn't mesh well with the idea of a bureaucratic system that's politically not like that. That's exactly the kinds of, on a small scale, that the states that imagine themselves as modern states have a problem with. Never mind, we're going to loyalty on voting. I mean, we're not even talking about voting, right? What happens when you have a candidate who's in your tribe but not in the tribe of the Sultan? Okay, right? Or I'm going to set up a local governance structure, the mayors, the judges, and I'm going to appoint as the Sultan someone from my tribe to your village. And you go, I don't know this. I'm not going to listen to him. I'm going to go to my village, he's in my tribe. Right? So we're talking enormous levels of, that kind of thinking with how do you govern, how do you rule, how do you manage loyalty, etc. So that's exactly what we're doing. And that's why, in part, the Baptist state was saying this is backward, this is not modern, this is, right? I mean, and anthropologists, that's not our approach, because this is what you have loyalty to, the modern state is trying to, it's not like they stand outside of that. It's not all meritocracy anyway, but you can see the tension. All right, so going back to how this manifestation, so on the one hand, the idea is that tribal identification is pretty modern, right? It's a problem for the modern state. Loyalty is to people within the tribe and not the state structure. Meritocracy doesn't work. All of these conflicts, right? So the question is, how do you cultivate a sense of citizenship beyond tribal loyalty, right? But at the same time, in a place like Jordan or Oman, this tribal identification is actually kind of useful, right? Because ultimately, the Hashemite regime and ultimately the Abu Sayyid in Oman present themselves as, ruling and loyalty to the tribal element. Is everyone? So that's where we have, and so, tribal identification can be cultivated, but it has to be done carefully. One of the places where, so on a very basic, probably, I'm not talking about a conspiracy where I'm trying to cultivate tribal identification, but one of the places, very simply, where you can see people being what we call, called upon to be tribal, and again, not necessarily intentional, not conspiracy, none of that, but into which you suddenly feel like you must have a tribe, is something as simple as filling out an official form. So any official form, registering for school, like I said, getting a driver's license, applying for a passport, all of these things, asks you, what is your tribe? And if you're Palestinian in Jordan, and you're like, well, I don't have a tribe, like, well, report it. Right? Or, right, you just Well, or we'll write you, make you a tribe. So in Oman, the way it works is that people take their last names or ethnic identification and transform them into a tribal structure. So if you're Baluch in Oman, the Baluch are not necessarily structured as a tribal system necessarily. So a Baluch has to fill out a form. What does he do? He calls himself al-Baluchi. So he transforms his ethnic identification into a tribal nomenclature, into a tribal name. So I'm Limbert. I fill out a bazillion forms saying I'm a Limbert. Right? Because the form calls me as an individual to structure myself in tribal terms. Does everyone follow me? And this is just on a very basic level in terms of how a population is helped shape into a tribal structure, even if they're not. And even if, theoretically, the tribal system is supposedly antithetical to the modern nation state. Does everyone follow me? So all of you would, in filling out a form in Oman, be required to transform your self-identification into a tribal system. That doesn't necessarily mean that you would suddenly overnight think of yourselves tribally organized. Right, were you going to add something, Karen?
Yeah, I was thinking that where we have to all fill out the forms and names.
So it's exactly the same thing. So you are so I fill out this form, right? The race form, and you're like, one, the forms don't make any sense at all, right? I mean, I don't know if you find them making any sense. I don't find that they make any sense at all, right? And yet you're suddenly put in a situation to be called upon to make a choice, right? And they just don't make any sense, right? Like why is some group a race and another group not a race? And, right? And they change all the time. Like 1 year, there are no races in this category, and then the next year there are a billion of them in some category. That's exactly the same kind of thing. And it doesn't mean everyone walks around necessarily thinking of themselves in racialized terms because of that, but they probably do a little more than they would have otherwise. Right, with a question. Is that, yeah. So, in a place like Oman or in a place like Jordon, they don't ask you, well, they have there's a vague category called jins, which can be anything from sex, gender, to nationality. It just means type. Right? So this is, a jinsia as like either can be your nationality or it can be your sex, gender. They kind of know. I don't know the forms in Egypt. I don't imagine in Egypt you have to fill out forms that are hard. Yeah. But in the form, does it ask you your qabali, your tribe? Yeah. I don't think in Egypt they would. Yeah, because in Egypt, right, the political state in its nationalist, secularist, modernist, so religion you might have to fill out, but tribe, and it wouldn't make sense to me. I mean, if you're thinking about Nasser would like the Ba'athist state in Iraq was adamantly secular, nationalist, modernist, and would have not at all wanted a tribal structure as being part of its underlying ideology. So everyone's following this. The same thing in Iran. I mean, it also has to do with, the majority of the population of Oman probably in some form has imagined itself tribally, but it's much more supported by the modern state than it was before. So it's not as though the modern state has gotten rid of this tribal structure, in fact, but in an attempt to co-opt it in managing authority and relationships. Okay. So that gets to another level of difficulty, which is if you have the tribal structure being shored up and modernized, right? So you have basically a very modern tribal system in some of the states and not others. Right? If you have a very modern system, then you have a situation too where people have to choose what tribe you're in. It's very formalized. And it starts to feel much more rigid. In other words, you ask the question of loyalty in terms of, okay, if I go to an office and I say I'm from this tribe, am I then going to get support from someone in another tribe, in my same tribe? So there's that problem, which, in a democratic state system, one would say that that's nepotism. Some would say that's corruption, right? In a tribal structure, you'd say, well, that's what you do. I mean, it's not nepotism, it's not corruption. That's just how you manage loyalty and relationships. It's not corrupt. It's not, so that's the tension there. But then there's another level of this, which is how do people understand or self-identify what tribe? So, we're gonna ask.
Is it possible to be part of more than one
Yeah. So what do you mean? What can you explain to me? That's exactly what I'm trying to
What
get.
if your dad from another and your mom's from another tribe, so you go to it's automatically a father?
Well, it depends on where you are, but most of these particular tribal structures are patrilineal. So you would always belong to your father's tribe. But that also means that as a woman, if you get married to a man from a different tribe, your tribal loyalty is to your father, not your husband. Okay? So that creates a lot of protections for you, because if you have problems with your husband, you haven't given over your property, you haven't given your identification, you have your protection patrilineal, no matter what. You will not change your tribal name. You keep the tribal name of your father, you don't take the tribal name of your husband. So, but for the children is patrilineal, so they'll take the tribal name of their father. Okay. So that sort of takes care of that issue. But what it doesn't take care of is the question of sort of sub-tribes. Like, so if you have a tribe, you have multiple tribes often within that tribe. And you get in a situation where you're like, this group says, you know what? You tribal people, you as a tribe, believe that Karen is our leader. So if they're saying, you know what? We're like in the same tribe, but I don't. So I'm going to go over here, and you guys, because of the way you're related to each other, yeah, we're going to break off. And we're going to now be another tribe. And we might have alliances if there's a very important thing, but in general, we're going to go off, which means that then you take another tribal name. Okay. Now, if you're in a modern nation state, and you have to take census, population, arrangements, but not only that, imagine that your governing structure is incorporating the tribal system. What we've done is created, let's say, every town or village has a council, and decisions are made in terms of tribal structure. That council is supposed to be made up of the tribal leaders, right? But what happens if Rivka goes off and creates an own tribe? she's gonna start saying, well, you know what, I'm gonna be tribe and I need representation in that council. But it's the state that has to recognize you as a tribe to have representation. Is everyone following what's happening now? So now we're saying, okay, you're going off and you're going to be a sub-tribe, but you want, as a sub-tribe, you have a problem with this tribe, but part of the problem is you don't want them representing you. You want to go and represent yourselves in council, in governance. So you have to then apply to be recognized as a tribe. Is everyone following? And this is where then the council in these villages or towns has to be recognized by the modern nation state as actually representing, and the state has to keep a list of recognized tribes. Is everyone following? Which means legitimating, recognizing, creating, right? There's a murky relationship between how, this idea of the tribe and the tribal structure is maintained. But of course, in practice, traditionally, not everyone has actually either thought of themselves in tribal structures, even in a place like Oman, that people in general, a lot of people, I say 60%, 70%. Right? But beyond that, it creates a situation where Rizka says, you know what, maybe it's better that we don't actually go off. Maybe we should actually go off onto you. Because even though or pretend you were two separate tribes, but you're not being recognized, you have a couple options. If you keep fighting to be recognized, or you can say, wait, we give up on this fight, let's change our tribal alliance and relationship, and suddenly we'll become you. We'll be part of your tribe. Which means reimagining genealogy, which means reimagining marriage structures, which means reimagining history. You know what I'm saying? You can see all of this, how it's manifesting on one hand. Secondly, then you have a situation where, as I was saying, people are not only on the everyday level necessarily tribally affiliated, but they look for questions of maintaining conflict resolution and decision-making, not from a tribal elder, but actually from, like, a religious authority. Right? So in the town where I was, where, I've been going there since the mid-90s. I've known these people, my friends for 20 years. There's constantly the tension of not only the tribal leader, so everyone, they're supposedly recognized tribes, and each tribe supposedly has a representative of the recognized tribe, right? Never mind all the other tribes that aren't recognized, right? Because there are lots of tribes, families that aren't recognized as tribes. And so they either have to bump onto another tribe or whatever, figure out all the things to do, practically. But then on top of that, the governing state organizes not only in terms of tribal organization, they have another two levels of governing, which is the neighborhood shape and the religious shape. Is everyone following? So, the state has to appoint a tribal leader for each tribe, but then you have tribes in multiple villages. So there's a leader of a tribe that will have authority over village A, B, and C, because tribes don't make the same village, right? You have the Hashimis all over, right? The question is who decided that it's Hashimi, okay? Because if you're a minor tribe of a Hashimi, that it's useful to be a Hashimi, or no, you get the question. But then, we have a Hashimi tribe over here, but then in the villages and the towns, you say, okay, beyond that, as a modern state system, we have to have something like a community board, your city council member, right? So my city council member, Jimmy Van Bramer, right? So you have a village, Queens, and each neighborhood in Queens has to have their council leader, their leader, that is not tribal, supposedly, but is somehow elected somewhere else. So then you have two conflicting tribal authorities. And what happens, of course, is that the traditional tribal family that led the village, that neighborhood, like the Ballones in Astoria, right? Everyone knows the Ballones, right? The Ballones keep reproducing Ballones, like they're the tribal elders, right? And they just, okay. So it's the same thing where the neighborhood structure sort of morphs sometimes into this. We have that multiple, and then of course on an everyday level, I would say, you know what, who is this recognized neighborhood authority, who's a city council person, and who is this tribal person? I don't listen to either. The person I'm gonna listen to is my religious faith. That is my person who's my more spiritual advisor. And so that is just completely undermining the other two, or is a parallel system. When you're a modern state, trying to manage these conflicts is incredibly complicated. Never mind people's senses of them, which is what these articles are trying to. In Jordon example, sort of look at how sort of cultivation, the internal cultivation. Is this the way? Does this make sense? All this, sort of. No. Don't say what in there. What doesn't make sense? No.
I don't know, I was thinking between the tribalism of a lot of people have these
What's the major difference? Well, what the articles are trying to say is that it's not so much tribalism itself that's different. What it is that tribalism is an idea. Tribalism is an idea and it's a practice that states have to deal with. And so it's not so much that you can ask how is tribalism per se different, but what you can ask is how does the notion of the tribe become part of the political structure in Jordan and in beyond, and how are they different in those two contexts? And they're different in those two contexts because in Iraq, the idea of tribalism is completely entwined in the Ba'athist ideology, which was anti-colonial, anti-tribal early. They manifest in very extreme tribalism, like they created it, right? After saying it was a nightmare. In Jordan, the idea of a tribe and the way it manifests is very different because it's part of the national, it's part of national identity from Jordan County. And it's cultivated in a very, so it's just, both of them are about political organization and they're actually about decision making. Very secretive. The way they're manifested, their histories are very different, and the relationships. That